1.4 quadratic equations. So we have the zero factor property, which basically just says once we factor something, we set each piece equal to 0 and we solve for each piece, and those are solutions to the equation. We have the square root property. If we're taking the square root of something, like x squared equals 4, then x equals plus or minus 2. And always, always, always remember the plus or minus, because that's usually the killer for people. As far as completing the square, that's probably the most difficult thing in this section. It tends to be post Algebra 2 when it starts to click for people and they start to really understand what completing the square is. It took me through college to really understand, like, I could do it, but I was like, why? I now understand. So just be aware of that. That'll probably be the hardest thing in this section. And then the quadratic formula, which you've been doing since Algebra 1, so hopefully that won't be too bad, but we'll just see what we get through at this point, and then we'll go from there. So solve the equation using the zero factor property. So these ones start us out with something that needs to be factored. So 2x squared minus x minus 15 equals 0. So first and foremost, I need to factor the left side so that I can break it down. And so I need factors of 2 times 15 that add up to -1. So factors of -30 that add up to -1. What would those be? And which one's going to be negative? Yep. So this is negative, so the bigger number needs to be negative. So -6 and +5. So 2x squared minus 6x plus 5x minus 15. You don't want to forget that equals 0 part. Factor by grouping. And just as a reminder, it doesn't matter, these middle terms, it doesn't matter which order I write them in. I could write 2x squared plus 5x and then minus 6x minus 15. It's not going to change anything. I usually try to set them up so that I can factor things out nicely, but you don't have to do it any particular way. So what am I taking out of these two? 2x. And what does that leave me with in there? X minus 3. What am I taking out of these two? 5. That leaves me with x minus 3. And remember, we're looking for these two things to match. So I have 2x plus 5 times x minus 3 equals 0. So now the zero factor property says take each piece and set it equal to 0. So 2x plus 5 equals 0. X minus 3 equals 0. So now we solve each of the pieces for x and we'll have two separate answers. If we had 3 factors, we would have 3 answers, so on and so forth. So 2x equals -5 divided by 2. X equals -5 over 2. Over here, x equals 3. So our two answers are -5/2 and 3. And so basically, if I plug those back into the original equation and I solve on the left, it should be equal to 0. Is what that's saying. So you can always plug it back in to check it. And since I typically let you have your calculator, you can always use your calculator to plug it back in and make sure you got it right. That way you don't have to worry about getting it wrong. do another one like that. 22. 9x squared minus 12x plus 4 equals 0. So I need, where'd it go? I need factors of 9 and 4, so factors of 36 that add up to give me negative 12. 6 and 6, what about the signs on them? Both negative, because this is positive and I need this to be negative, so when I add them together I need that. So I've got 9x squared minus 6x minus 6x plus 4. I think this one actually works out that it would have been a special type, but we don't have to do it that way. What am I taking out of these first two? 3x. And what does that leave me with?
3x.
Yep. What am I taking out of these two? That negative is with that 6, by the way. So, yes, 2, but I also need to take out a negative. Do you know why?
So they match.
Yep, so I need it because I need them to match. So if you just took out a 2, we would have been left with negative 3x plus 2, and we would have had to say, oh, that's not right. So I need to take out a negative with it so that they now match. So now I have 3x minus 2 and 3x minus 2. Since those are the same thing, because this was actually a perfect square trinomial, all I have to do is solve it out once. If you do it twice, it's not wrong, but all you need to do it is once. So you just have 3x minus 2 equals 0. So 3x equals 2. X equals 2/3. So what we would have here, this is more for future reference, not so much for right now, but we would have a double 0 at 2/3 is all that means, because there's two factors there. Because essentially this is the same as 3x minus 2 squared equals 0. And so we just like get rid of the square, basically. Take the square root of both sides of the square root of 0 is 0. So anyways, like I said, if you didn't recognize that, or you were like, no, I have to set each piece equal to 0, and you got two problems where x equals 2/3, I'm not going to take off for that. It's totally fine. All right, any questions on the 0 factor property? The only thing that's really different is after you factor, you set it equal to 0. So, nothing too crazy. Using the square root property now. I'm going to start with something easy. 26x squared equals 121. So if I want x by itself, what do I have to do? To take the square root of both sides. What happens when I do this? It's 11, but how many answers do I get when I take a square root? 2, so it's plus or minus 11. Okay, you can either write it like this, or you can write it as x equals 11 or x equals negative 11. If you get into math in college, the professor's probably going to want you to write it this way, because this isn't technically right, because it can't be both at the same time. But everyone always just writes it this way, so I don't really care. Take your pick. But sometimes you'll see me write it like this. Sometimes you'll see it like this. Let's see, 28. 48 minus x squared equals 0. I need to solve for x. What do I do first? Subtract 48, so I get negative x squared equals negative 48. Now what? Yep, I need to divide by the negative, take it out. So I get x squared equals 48. Now what? Square root both sides. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 48. And we should always see if we can break down a radical any farther than what it is. So 48 would factor into what? 2 and 24. 24 would factor into 6 and 4. 6 factors into 2 and 3. 4 is 2 and 2. So now I can take out, there's 1 pair of 2's, 2 pair of 2's, and then I have a 3 left over. So my answer is going to end up being x is equal to plus or minus 2 times 2, so 4 root 3. And some people think that when you take something out, it goes in front of the plus or minus. It does not. That's still all part of the plus or minus of the square root because it all goes together with what we took the square root of. So make sure you keep it touching the square root and then the plus or minus out front. Let's see. 34. X minus 4 squared equals negative 5. So when I have a problem like this, a lot of people are tempted to add the 4 over, but it's being squared in the x minus 4 part, so I can't do that. I actually have to take the square root of both sides first. So I'm going to end up with x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of negative 5. Now, what happens with that? It becomes I. So you can, I usually will write it in front just because I don't want it to be confused. So I would do this as x minus 4 equals plus or minus I root 5. If you wanted to instead write it as x minus 4 equals plus or minus root 5 and then like draw the I out here so that you can tell it's not under the radical, that's fine too. But I usually just do this so it doesn't get confused. Now I still need x by itself, so I need to add the 4 over. So I get x equals 4 plus or minus I root 5, and that would be my final on that one.
So when you have like a number in the square root, like where you would have 3 or 4, could you put an I in there?
Where?
Like
right here?
No, like in the square root itself. Like when we
This is inside the square root.
Like a cubed root, where the 3 is, but replace it with an I.
You're saying for it to be like the ith root of something?
Is that possible?
I've never seen it. I'm not going to say it's not possible at all, but I don't think so. I mean, you could, I guess, have a square root and a square root of that. Like this, I don't know. I've never seen it, so probably not. Taking a lot of math, probably not. All right, I'm going to backtrack and do 32 because there's something in this one I want us to see. In parentheses, 4x plus 1 squared equals 20. So I need to take the square root of both sides first. So that's going to give me 4x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Can I break down the square root of 20? What does it break into? 10 and 2. 10 is 5 and 2. So I can take out a set of 2's. So this is going to be 4x plus 1 equals plus or minus 2 root 5. So now I subtract the 1, so I get 4x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 root 5. Now I need to divide by 4, so I get x equals negative 1 plus or minus 2 root 5 over 4. Some people start trying to cancel this 4 and this 2, but I can't do that. Okay, if this was also a 2, I could factor a 2 out and then reduce, but because this piece is being added or subtracted to this other piece, I can't cancel here. So this would be where my final answer sits. Okay, any questions on that? All right, that's where we're going to stop because I forgot that clock is extraordinarily wrong. Apparently it decided to come back to life partially. I don't know how, but anyways, yesterday it was at the same time all day long, and today it has changed and it is now a totally different time. But I'm going to give you problems that are just zero factor property and square root property. That will be what the material on your quiz stops at. So that way Monday we can review. Okay, so completing the square in quadratic formula, and there's one other thing in this section that kind of ties into the quadratic formula. Will come later. So problems are, let's see, 15, 17. Now 17, it has like an x squared term and an x term is equal to a number. You've got to move that number over before you factor it because you've got to have the equation equal to 0 like this. So if it's not already in this form, you need to move all the stuff to one side so that it's something equal to 0. Just so you know. So we didn't have one like that. 21, and then square root property, 27, 31, and 35. So you would have a little bit of time at the beginning on Monday, but I would really prefer you to go ahead and do these this weekend. I mean, you have a few minutes left today that you could maybe get it done, but I would prefer for you to do them this weekend so that if you have questions, you can ask on Monday. I'm going to make sure I have all your homework to give back to you on Monday. If I forget, just remind me, because honestly, it's usually checked and it's just sitting in the box, and then when y'all leave, I'm like, I forgot to give them back their stuff. So I might actually go through and make sure everything's checked off and then give it back to you now, but anyways, just if I forget, make sure I give it back to you, and that way if you have questions, we can go over it. We can do some review type questions, and then Tuesday spiritual emphasis, so we won't have class, but Wednesday, if y'all have any like last minute questions before we actually start the quiz, I will happily answer them since we don't have class right the day before.